Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. 5,000 years ago, beneath the same stars you see tonight, a mason placed his hand on a block of stone, his palm pressed against the surface, still warm from the desert sun. He didn't know that thousands of years later, you would wonder about him, about his life, about his dreams, about whether he looked up at the same constellations and felt small beneath their vastness. Tonight, we're going to listen to echoes, not the kind that bounce off canyon walls, but the kind that ripple forward through time. The echoes of entire civilizations that rose from river mud and desert sand, that built wonders we can barely comprehend today, that developed languages and laws and art and mathematics. And then, like a candle flame in the wind, they flickered and went dark. But here's what keeps me awake at night, what I want you to drift asleep thinking about. Before there were smartphones, or electricity, or even books, humans had already mastered the impossible. They moved stones weighing tens of tons without wheels. They performed brain surgery with bronze tools. They calculated the movements of planets with stunning accuracy. They wrote poetry that still makes us cry. They built cities for hundreds of thousands of people with running water and sewage systems that wouldn't be matched for millennia. And archaeology, that patient detective of the past, keeps finding the most beautiful details, not just the grand temples and golden masks, but the ordinary moments that make these ancient people feel like neighbors we've somehow forgotten. A child's toy boat, carved from wood, found in an Egyptian tomb. A love letter pressed into clay in ancient Mesopotamia, the writer's fingerprints still visible. Bread, burned and forgotten in a Pompeii oven on that terrible morning when the mountain exploded. But there's a mystery here. Something that archaeologists discovered just 30 years ago that changed everything we thought we knew about the first civilization. In a buried temple in southern Iraq, they found something impossible, a series of clay tablets that described an event, a catastrophe so massive it reset human civilization. The tablets spoke of cities vanished overnight, of knowledge lost, of survivors struggling to remember what their ancestors had known. And the strange part, the part that sends shivers down academic spines, these tablets were dated to before the first cities were supposed to exist. What was there before Mesopotamia? What came before the beginning? The tablets hint at an older world, but the story breaks off. The rest remains buried somewhere beneath the desert sand, waiting. Tonight, we're going to journey through 100 calming facts about ancient peoples across our world. We'll travel chronologically from the very first cities rising beside sacred rivers to the twilight of the ancient world. These are bedtime stories about humanity's earliest chapters. Every fact is real. Every civilization actually existed. Every wonder was truly built by human hands that worked and bled and dreamed. Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable stories of ancient civilizations. The dreamers, builders, farmers, and artists who, against impossible odds, created worlds that still whisper to us today. From the first cities rising beside sacred rivers to empires that stretched across continents, their story is one of mystery, courage, beauty, and the eternal human spirit that never stopped reaching for something greater. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The land between two rivers. That's what Mesopotamia means in Greek. The Tigris and Euphrates, flowing like twin arteries through what is now Iraq, glowing golden under an ancient sun that baked the earth hard as pottery. Around 4000 BCE, something extraordinary happened in this river valley. People stopped wandering. They stopped following herds and seasons. They stayed, and in staying, they built Uruk, the world's first true city, 50,000 people living together, a number that seems small now, but was unimaginable then. This was humanity learning to live as neighbors, not just families or tribes. Uruk had walls, massive walls that stretched for 6 miles in a great circle, thick enough that chariots could race along the top. The king could ride his chariot atop those walls at sunset, looking out at farms and irrigation canals spreading like veins across the floodplain, and know that he ruled something unprecedented. A city, a concentration of human ambition and cooperation on a scale the world had never seen. The Sumerians, the people of Uruk and other cities, they gave us something even more important than walls. Around 3400 BCE, they invented writing, not for poetry or prayers at first, for accounting, for tracking grain in warehouses and sheep in pens. They pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets, creating cuneiform, and suddenly human thought could outlive human memory. The words you're hearing now, they're only possible because someone in ancient Sumer decided to make marks in mud. Imagine being a scribe in ancient Mesopotamia. You spent years, perhaps a decade, learning hundreds of cuneiform symbols, each one pressed at a different angle with a reed stylus. Your fingers cramped, your eyes ached in the lamplight, but being a scribe meant respect. It meant you rarely did manual labor under that brutal sun. It meant you might sit in the shade, recording the words of kings, preserving prayers to gods, keeping the memories of an entire civilization safe in clay. The Sumerians built ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids of brick rising toward heaven, temples where earth reached up to touch the realm of gods. The ziggurat of Ur, one of the best preserved, had 3 staircases climbing its sides, 2 for priests and worshippers, but the third, the center staircase, that one never reached the top. It stopped partway up. That staircase was for the god alone. No human foot was meant to touch it. At night, Sumerian astronomers climbed to the top of these ziggurats and watched the sky with an intensity we've forgotten. They tracked stars and planets with remarkable accuracy, learning the rhythms of the cosmos. They divided the sky into sections, naming constellations. The zodiac, those 12 signs that still appear in newspapers and dating apps. The Sumerians drew those boundaries in the heavens over 4,000 years ago. They invented the wheel around 3500 BCE. But here's the strange part. They didn't invent it for transportation. They invented it for pottery, creating the potter's wheel to shape clay vessels more quickly and evenly. Only later, a few hundred years later, did someone think to put wheels on a cart. Sometimes the most revolutionary inventions start with small practical problems. The Sumerians and the civilizations that followed them in Mesopotamia gave us the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest surviving story, written around 2100 BCE. Gilgamesh was a king, 2/3 god and 1/3 man, arrogant, and restless. He searches for immortality after his best friend dies. He journeys to the ends of the earth, crosses waters of death, finds the secret of eternal life, a plant growing at the bottom of the ocean. He retrieves it. He has won. But on his journey home, while Gilgamesh bathes in a pool, a serpent steals the plant and eats it, shedding its skin and becoming young again. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, learning the lesson that all humans must learn. We cannot live forever. What matters is what we build, whom we love, what we leave behind. In 1750 BCE, King Hammurabi of Babylon created something that still echoes in our courtrooms today. He carved 282 laws into a black stone pillar, laws that covered everything from property disputes to medical malpractice. Hammurabi's code gave us eye for an eye, justice, the idea that punishment should fit the crime, but the laws weren't equal. A noble who lost an eye received different compensation than a slave who lost an eye. Justice was stratified by social class, a reminder that ancient wisdom was always imperfect, always human. Babylonian mathematicians used a base 60 system, not base 10 like we use today, base 60. And because of this choice made thousands of years ago, we still have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Ancient Babylon is still measuring your time, even now, even as you drift towards sleep. The Babylonians had a creation myth called the Enuma Elish. In the beginning, there was only chaos, salt water and fresh water mixing, giving birth to gods. The gods fought. The youngest god, Marduk, defeated the chaos dragon Tiamat, split her body in half, and from her corpse made the sky and the earth. And humans in this story, humans were created from the blood of a defeated god, created specifically to serve the gods, to work the fields and build the temples so that the gods could rest. It's a sobering origin story. We were meant to be servants, but Mesopotamians also invented beer, thick, nutritious beer that was more like porridge than the beer we know today. They drank it through long straws to avoid the grain sediment floating on top. Workers were paid in beer rations, receiving 2 to 4 liters per day depending on their job. Imagine going to work and your salary arriving in jugs of fresh beer. It wasn't luxury, it was sustenance. Beer was calories, hydration, and probably one of the few joys available to people working under the desert sun. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world was supposedly in Babylon. The hanging gardens, terraced gardens rising in green levels, irrigated by some ingenious system, a paradise of flowers and trees in the desert. But here's the mystery. No archaeological evidence has ever been found. No Babylonian text mentions them. Some scholars now think the gardens were actually in Nineveh, or that they never existed at all. A beautiful legend confused with reality by Greek writers who never saw them. During scorching summers, families in Mesopotamian cities slept on their rooftops. The houses were built with mud bricks that absorbed the day's heat and released it slowly through the night. Better to sleep under stars where breezes could reach you. Imagine falling asleep on a flat roof, the murmur of neighbors' voices from other rooftops, the smell of the river on the night air, the same stars that still shine tonight wheeling overhead. Mesopotamians had cylinder seals, tiny carved stones drilled through the middle and worn on cords around the neck. Each seal was unique, showing animals, gods, mythical creatures in miniature relief art. When pressed into soft clay, the seal created a signature, proof of identity and ownership. Thousands of these seals survive, each one a glimpse into how someone 4,000 years ago wanted to be remembered. A bull for strength, a lion for courage, a goddess for protection. And at night, the crescent moon hung over Babylon, symbol of sin, the moon god. The Mesopotamians organized their calendar by lunar months, watching the moon wax and wane, marking time by its cycles. The moon that lights your window tonight, if it's visible, that same moon guided shepherds and sailors and scribes in ancient Sumer. But Mesopotamia was only the beginning. While clay cities rose between the Tigris and Euphrates, another river civilization was awakening in Africa, beside a river that made the impossible possible. The Nile and the people there would build monuments so massive, so precise, that some still argue they had help from lost technologies or even beings from the stars. But the truth, the human truth, is even more remarkable than any fantasy. Picture a river flowing north through endless desert. Without it, there would be nothing, no people, no cities, no civilization, just sand stretching to every horizon under a sun that could kill you in hours. But the Nile exists, and because it exists, one of history's most magnificent civilizations rose from dust. The Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land, named for the rich dark soil the Nile deposited each year when it flooded. Beyond the narrow green strip along the river lay Deshret, the Red Land, the desert that protected Egypt like fortress walls. Every summer, the Nile rose. It flooded the fields, covering them in water, thick with nutrients from the mountains of Africa. Then the waters receded, leaving behind black earth so fertile that Egypt could feed millions. Around 3100 BCE, a king named Narmer unified two kingdoms into one, Upper Egypt in the south, where the Nile flowed from, Lower Egypt in the north, where the river spread into a delta before meeting the sea. Narmer wore a crown that combined both kingdoms, white and red merged together. From that moment forward, pharaohs would be more than kings. They would be gods walking on earth, living intermediaries between the people and the eternal. The Old Kingdom began around 2686 BCE. In this period, these centuries became the age of pyramid building, the age when Egypt decided to make monuments that would outlast time itself. Around 2560 BCE, Pharaoh Khufu commanded the building of a pyramid at Giza. When it was finished, it stood as the tallest human structure on Earth. It would hold that record for 3,800 years. The Great Pyramid used 2.3 million stone blocks. Each block weighed between 2 and 15 tons. Some of the granite blocks in the internal chambers weighed 80 tons. These stones were quarried and transported without wheels, without iron tools, without any of the machinery we consider essential today. Teams of workers used copper tools and stone hammers. They dragged blocks on wooden sledges. They built ramps. They worked through the flood season when farming was impossible and they needed employment. The pyramid was originally covered in polished white limestone that reflected sunlight like a mirror. Imagine seeing it from miles away, a perfect geometric mountain gleaming so bright you had to shield your eyes. The limestone casing was stripped away over the centuries, reused for buildings in Cairo, but in its original form, The pyramid must have looked like something divine had placed it there. The sides of the pyramid align almost perfectly with true north, south, east, and west. The alignment is accurate to within 4 minutes of arc. That's a margin of error so small it seems impossible without magnetic compasses or modern surveying equipment. The Egyptians achieved this through astronomical observation, watching stars wheel across the night sky, understanding the cosmos well enough to transfer that knowledge into stone. At Giza, archaeologists found the workers' village where pyramid builders lived. They found bakeries that could produce thousands of loaves daily. They found the bones of cattle and fish, evidence of a diet better than most Egyptians could expect. And they found graffiti on the blocks themselves, painted in red ochre. The crews had names: friends of Khufu, drunkards of Menkaure. These men took pride in their work. They competed with other crews. They were building something that would touch eternity. We know they weren't slaves because their skeletons tell stories. The workers who died building the pyramids were buried with respect near the monuments they created. Their bones show evidence of medical care, broken bones that healed properly, successful surgeries. Someone cared whether these workers lived or died. Someone set their fractures and gave them time to recover. Egyptian civilization became obsessed with death, not in a morbid way, but in the way of people who believed this life was merely a doorway to something greater. Mummification took 70 days. The body was washed in wine and spices. The internal organs were removed through careful incisions, everything except the heart. The brain was extracted through the nose using a long bronze hook, discarded as useless. They didn't know the brain was important. They thought consciousness resided in the heart. The removed organs went into canopic jars, 4 containers protected by the 4 sons of Horus. Each son had a different head: a human head for the liver, a baboon for the lungs, a jackal for the stomach, a falcon for the intestines. These jars were sealed and placed in the tomb because you would need your organs in the afterlife. The body was packed in natron, a natural salt that drew out all moisture, and rotter. After 40 days, the corpse was dried, no longer subject to decay. Then came the wrapping, hundreds of meters of linen strips, each layer anointed with oils and resins. Prayers were recited. The person was being transformed into something that could last forever. But preservation of the body wasn't enough. The soul had to navigate the underworld. The Book of the Dead was a collection of spells and instructions, maps of the afterlife, passwords to get through 7 gates. At each gate, you had to know the name of the guardian. You had to recite the correct spell. One mistake, and you were lost. The final test was the weighing of the heart. You stood in a great hall before 42 judges. You recited the negative confession, listing all the sins you hadn't committed. I have not killed. I have not stolen. I have not caused pain. Then your heart was placed on one side of a scale. On the other side, a single feather, the feather of Mad, goddess of truth and justice. If your heart was light, unburdened by evil, it balanced with the feather. You passed into paradise, the field of reeds, where the crops grew tall and the weather was always perfect. But if your heart was heavy with sin, it tipped the scales, and then Amit waited, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, the devourer of souls. She ate your heart, and you ceased to exist. Not just death, but annihilation. The Egyptians feared that more than anything. Tutankhamun was a minor pharaoh. He became pharaoh at age 9, and died at 19 around 1323 BCE. He would have been forgotten except for one extraordinary fact. His tomb was discovered almost intact in 1922 by Howard Carter. When Carter made a hole in the sealed door and held up a candle, someone asked what he could see. He whispered, "Wonderful things." The tomb contained over 5,000 objects: golden chariots, alabaster vases, gilded furniture, a golden throne showing Tutankhamun and his wife in an intimate moment, her hand on his shoulder, the sun god blessing them, and the coffins, three nested coffins, each more magnificent than the last. The innermost coffin was solid gold, weighing 110 kilograms. When they lifted the final lid, they saw Tutankhamun's face, captured in gold leaf, serene and young forever. Egypt had female pharaohs, though they were rare. Hatshepsut ruled for 22 years, one of the longest reigns of any pharaoh. But she faced a problem. The word pharaoh meant great house, but was understood as masculine. So Hatshepsut wore the false beard that pharaohs wore. She dressed in male clothing in official portraits. She was referred to with male pronouns in inscriptions. After her death, her successor tried to erase her from history, chiseling her name from monuments. But enough survived that we remember her as one of Egypt's most successful rulers. Hieroglyphics combine sound symbols, whole word symbols, and symbolic pictures in the same text. A single inscription might have signs that represented individual sounds like our alphabet, signs that represented entire words, and signs that clarified meaning but weren't pronounced. Reading hieroglyphics required years of study. Only scribes could do it, and when Egypt fell and the old religion died, the knowledge of how to read the sacred writing died with it. For over 1,000 years, hieroglyphics remained mysterious. People could see the beautiful carved symbols on temple walls, but couldn't read them. Then in 1799, French soldiers in Egypt found a stone, the Rosetta Stone. It contained the same text in three scripts: Demotic, a simplified Egyptian script; in the middle, ancient Greek at the bottom. Scholars could read Greek. By comparing the three versions, Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the code in 1822. Suddenly, Egypt could speak again. Egyptian medicine was surprisingly advanced. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, written around 1600 BCE, but copying older knowledge, describes 48 surgical cases. It reads like a modern medical textbook. It describes skull fractures, spinal injuries, broken collarbones. For each case, it gives the examination procedure, diagnosis, and treatment. Some cases it declares untreatable, an injury of his spine, an ailment not to be treated. The physicians knew their limits. Egyptian doctors performed surgery. They set broken bones. They stitched wounds with thread made from linen. They created splints. They even performed what might have been brain surgery, though whether patients survived is unclear. And they used moldy bread as an antibiotic for infections. They didn't know about penicillin, but they knew empirically that certain moldy breads helped wounds heal. Both men and women in Egypt wore makeup, not for vanity alone, though Egyptians certainly appreciated beauty. Black hole eyeliner contained lead compounds that actually stimulated the immune system. The makeup helped protect against eye infections that were common in the dusty desert environment. Fashion and medicine combined. Cats were sacred animals associated with the goddess Bastet. Cats protected grain stores from mice and rats. They were useful, but they were also beloved. Killing a cat, even by accident, was punishable by death. When a family cat died, everyone in the household shaved their eyebrows in mourning. Cats were mummified with the same care as humans. Thousands of mummified cats have been found in cat cemeteries. The Sphinx crouches beside the pyramids at Giza, carved from a single outcrop of limestone around 2500 BCE, a lion's body with a human head, possibly representing Pharaoh Khafre. The Sphinx's nose is missing. Stories claim Napoleon's soldiers used it for target practice, but this is myth. The nose was already missing by the time Napoleon arrived. A more likely story says a Sufi Muslim destroyed it in the 1300s because he considered it idolatrous. Akhenaten was a revolutionary pharaoh who ruled around 1353 to 1336 BCE. He did something unthinkable. He abandoned all of Egypt's gods, thousands of gods worshipped for millennia, and declared there was only one God. He moved the capital to a new city he built in the desert, Amarna. He changed art styles, having himself depicted with an elongated skull and feminine features. But after Akhenaten died, Egypt rejected his revolution completely. His son, who would become Tutankhamun, abandoned Amarna and restored the old gods. Akhenaten's name was erased from king lists. His city was abandoned. Egypt wanted to forget he existed. His attempt to change everything lasted only as long as his life. The Valley of the Kings is a wadi, the dry riverbed cutting into desert cliffs on the west bank of the Nile. There, pharaohs of the New Kingdom were buried in tombs carved deep into the rock. No more pyramids broadcasting the location of treasure. These tombs were hidden, filled with riches, then sealed. The tomb robbers found almost all of them. Only Tutankhamun's small tomb survived intact to the modern age. The walls of these tombs were covered in paintings, not the formal stiff figures of temple walls, but vibrant scenes. The journey through the night, when the sun god traveled through the underworld, demons and trials, transformations, and finally, sunrise, rebirth, the promise that death was not ending, but transformation. As the sun sets over the Nile tonight, it sets the same way it has for 5,000 years. The same light that illuminated pharaohs building their eternal houses now fades over their ruins. But while Egypt built monuments meant to last forever, across the world another civilization was rising that history almost forgot entirely. Around 2600 BCE, in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, a civilization appeared that seems to have emerged fully formed. There was no gradual development. Archaeologists can trace, one moment scattered villages, the next perfectly planned cities, laid out with a sophistication that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were the two great cities, though dozens of smaller settlements spread across 500,000 square kilometers. When you look at the layout of these cities, you see something remarkable: perfect grid patterns, streets running north to south, east to west, intersecting at right angles. But this wasn't arbitrary. The streets were oriented to catch the prevailing winds, natural air conditioning flowing through the city. In a climate where summer temperatures reached 50 degrees Celsius, this made survival bearable. Every house in these cities had a bathroom. Think about that for a moment. In 2600 BCE, every single house had a private bathroom with a drain connected to covered sewers running along every street. Rome, at its height, wouldn't have this level of urban sanitation until 2,000 years later. London wouldn't have comprehensive sewers until the 1800s CE. But in the Indus Valley, 4,600 years ago, wastewater flowed through brick channels covered to prevent smell and contamination, emptying into larger mains. The sophistication is staggering. At Mohenjo-Daro, there's a structure called the Great Bath, a pool 12 meters long and 2.4 meters deep, built with perfectly fitted bricks and waterproofed with bitumen. Steps lead down into it from both ends. Rooms surround it. Scholars believe it was used for ritual purification, but we can't be certain. What we know is that the construction shows extraordinary engineering skill. The bath didn't leak. Water was supplied from a well, drained through an outlet, all with precise calculations of water flow. Everything in the Indus Valley civilization was standardized. The bricks were made in a ratio of 4 to 2 to 1, length to width to height, whether you were in a coastal town or a mountain settlement hundreds of kilometers away. The bricks were identical. This suggests either incredible organization or a cultural commitment to uniformity that we can barely imagine. They had weights for trade, small carved stones in specific masses. The base unit was 28 grams, then 28 grams doubled, quadrupled, and so on. These weights have been found across the entire civilization, from coastal Gujarat to the mountains of Afghanistan. A merchant in one city could trade with a merchant from another city hundreds of kilometers away, and both would be using the same system. Trust between strangers becomes possible when everyone plays by the same rules. The Indus people had writing. Over 400 distinct symbols appear on seals, pottery, and small tablets. But despite decades of effort, no one has deciphered it. The inscriptions are frustratingly short, most only 5 or 6 symbols. There's no Rosetta Stone to give us a key. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't know if the symbols represent sounds like an alphabet or concepts like Chinese characters. The Indus script remains one of archaeology's most tantalizing mysteries. What we do have are the seals, small squares of steatite, carved with images and script, pierced so they could be worn on cords. The images are beautiful and strange. Bulls with powerful shoulders, elephants, tigers, and unicorns. Not the horse with a horn from European myth, but a powerful creature that appears again and again, possibly a religious symbol. These seals were pressed into soft clay to mark ownership, to authenticate goods in trade. Trade connected the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia. Indus seals have been found in Sumerian cities. Mesopotamian texts mention a place called Meluha, describing trade goods that match what the Indus produced. Ships crossed the Arabian Sea, carrying cotton cloth, precious stones, ivory. The Indus people were part of a world system, connected to civilizations thousands of kilometers away. Cotton cultivation began in the Indus Valley. While Mesopotamia and Egypt wore wool and linen, the Indus people wore cotton. Light, breathable, perfect for the climate. They grew cotton, spun it into thread, wove it into cloth. Cotton fabric doesn't preserve well in archaeological sites, but we have indirect evidence. Cloth impressions on pottery, references in Mesopotamian texts to cloth from Meluha. Their jewelry shows incredible craftsmanship. Long necklaces made from carnelian beads, each bead perfectly shaped and polished, but the truly impressive part is the drilling. To thread a necklace, You need a hole through each bead. Carnelian is hard. The Indus craftspeople used diamond-tipped drills to create perfectly smooth holes through these beads. A single bead might take weeks to complete. Patience turned into beauty. Houses were 2 stories tall with inner courtyards and private wells. The homes faced inward, prioritizing privacy. The outside walls, facing the street, were blank, no windows looking out. Life happened in the courtyard, away from public view. Each house was its own small fortress of family life. And here's what's strange: what makes the Indus Valley civilization unique among all ancient civilizations. There are no palaces, no temples, no weapons, no fortifications, no evidence of warfare at all. Every other major civilization we know had massive monuments to power. Egypt had pyramids and temples that dominated the landscape. Mesopotamia had ziggurats and palace complexes. China had royal tombs filled with bronze weapons. But the Indus Valley civilization seems to have been remarkably egalitarian. The largest buildings were only slightly larger than regular homes. There's no archaeological evidence of a king or a priesthood controlling everything. This suggests something unprecedented, a civilization that ran on cooperation rather than coercion, on consensus rather than command. It's almost utopian, and because it's so different from everything else we know, some archaeologists are skeptical. They think we just haven't found the palaces yet. But the evidence keeps piling up. This was a peaceful society. The dancing girl statue is one of the most famous artifacts from Mohenjo-Daro, a bronze figurine only 10.5 centimeters tall. But what a figure! A young woman, probably a dancer, standing in a relaxed pose, one hand on her hip, the other arm bent, hand dangling, her body weight shifted to one leg. She wears bracelets on her arm, a necklace. Her expression is confident, almost defiant. The artist who made her 4,500 years ago understood human anatomy perfectly, understood how weight shifts, how muscles show beneath skin. She feels alive. Around 1900 BCE, something went wrong. The cities began to decline. People left. New construction stopped. The sophisticated urban planning fell apart. Streets were no longer maintained. Houses were subdivided into smaller rooms, signs of declining prosperity. By 1300 BCE, the great cities were completely abandoned. What happened? Climate change is the leading theory. The monsoons that brought rain might have shifted. The rivers might have changed course or dried up. There's evidence that the Gagar Hakra, a major river system, began to fail around this time. Without reliable water, the cities became unsustainable. The people didn't disappear. They migrated south and east, carrying their culture with them. Elements of Indus civilization show up in later Indian cultures. But the urban phase ended. The cities were slowly buried by wind-blown soil and river sediment. They lay hidden for thousands of years. When British engineers were building railways through India in the 1800s, they found millions of old bricks in the ground, perfect bricks. They dug them up and used them as railway ballast, crushing ancient Harappa to build train tracks. Only later did archaeologists realize what had been destroyed, how much knowledge was lost because no one knew to look. The Indus Valley civilization lasted 700 years in its urban phase, 7 centuries of remarkable peace and prosperity. Then it faded, not with conquest or catastrophe, but with slow decline. People making rational decisions to leave cities that could no longer support them, going somewhere with more water, more opportunity, more hope. Today, the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro bake under the same sun that warmed it 4,500 years ago. The bricks are exposed, crumbling slowly. The great bath is empty. The streets are silent. But for those 7 centuries, tens of thousands of people lived there. They raised children. They made love and argued and laughed. They created beauty in beads and bronze. They built something extraordinary. And we still can't read their writing. We don't know their stories. We don't know their gods, if they had gods. We don't know what they called themselves. The civilization that might have been history's most peaceful society remains largely silent, speaking to us only through bricks and seals and the layout of streets designed to catch the wind. While the Indus Valley thrived in sophisticated peace, far to the east another civilization was forming along another great river. But this one would never fall. Dynasties would rise and collapse. Emperors would come and go. But Chinese civilization would continue in an unbroken line from its origins to today, making it the longest continuous civilization in human history. The Yellow River flows through northern China, carrying so much yellow silt that it colors the water like liquid earth. This river flooded regularly, destroying farms and drowning thousands. The Chinese called it China's sorrow, but the floods also deposited fertile soil, making agriculture possible in a landscape that would otherwise be too dry. From this contradiction, from this river that both gave life and took it away, Chinese civilization emerged. The Shang dynasty ruled from approximately 1600 to 1046 BCE, the first Chinese dynasty we can verify through archaeological evidence. Before the Shang, there might have been earlier dynasties. Chinese tradition speaks of the Shang dynasty before the Shang, but no one has found definitive proof. The Shang, though, we can touch. We have their cities, their tombs, their writing. Shang kings were obsessed with divination, with knowing the future. They used oracle bones, usually turtle shells or the shoulder blades of oxen. A question would be carved into the bone. Should we attack the neighboring kingdom? Will it rain next week? Will the king's toothache improve? Then the bone was heated with a hot poker until it cracked. The pattern of the cracks was interpreted as the answer from the ancestors or gods. Over 150,000 oracle bones have been discovered, and they contain the earliest Chinese writing. The characters carved into those bones 3,500 years ago are recognizably the ancestors of modern Chinese characters. A Chinese person today could look at a Shang oracle bone and identify some of the symbols that's continuity stretching across millennia. The Shang were master bronze workers. They created vessels for religious ceremonies, decorating them with intricate designs, dragons, birds, geometric patterns. Some of these bronze pieces are so sophisticated that modern metalworkers struggle to understand how they were made. The Shang used piece molds, creating each vessel in sections, fitting them together. It allowed for complexity that lost wax casting couldn't match. The Zhou dynasty conquered the Shang around 1046 BCE and introduced a concept that would shape Chinese political philosophy for the next 3,000 years: the mandate of heaven. The idea was simple but revolutionary. The rulers governed with divine approval, but that approval wasn't permanent. If a ruler governed badly, if there were floods and famines and wars, that was evidence that heaven had withdrawn its mandate. Rebellion against such a ruler wasn't just justified, it was necessary. It was cosmic correction. This created a paradox. Every Chinese dynasty claimed the mandate of heaven, but every dynasty eventually fell. And when it fell, the new dynasty said the old one had lost the mandate. History was written by winners who proved their legitimacy by pointing to the failure of those they defeated. The mandate made revolution thinkable, but it also meant every emperor lived with the knowledge that disaster could delegitimize everything. The Zhou dynasty lasted 800 years, the longest in Chinese history, but only because historians count the entire period when Zhou kings nominally ruled. In reality, Zhou power fragmented. Local lords became independent. China dissolved into competing states. This period, called the Spring and Autumn period, and then the Warring States period, was centuries of warfare and chaos. But chaos breeds philosophy. When the old order breaks down, people start asking fundamental questions. What makes a good society? How should people treat each other? What does it mean to live well? Confucius lived around 500 BCE during the late spring and autumn period. He came from a minor noble family that had fallen on hard times. He became a teacher, gathering disciples, trying to get hired by a ruler who would implement his ideas. He mostly failed. He wandered from state to state, offering advice that few rulers wanted to hear. He died thinking himself a failure, but his students preserved his teachings. The Analects, a collection of Confucius's sayings and conversations, became one of the most influential books in human history. Confucius taught that society needed harmony, that everyone had a role, that respect for tradition and elders held everything together. He taught that rulers should lead by moral example, not force, that education could make anyone better. His ideas shaped China for 2,500 years, spreading to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. A teacher who felt he had failed became the foundation of East Asian culture. Around the same time, another philosopher was supposedly writing, Laozi the Old Master, who may or may not have been a real person. The book attributed to him, the Tao Te Ching, is only about 5,000 Chinese characters. You can read it in an hour, but it's one of the most translated books in the world because it's also one of the most profound. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The opening lines immediately complicate everything. Laozi taught about Wu Wei, action through non-action, going with the flow of the universe rather than forcing things. Water was his favorite metaphor. Water is soft but carves through rock. It doesn't fight. It yields, but it always finds its way. Taoism became the mystical, intuitive counterbalance to Confucius's structured social philosophy. During the Warring States period, a military strategist wrote a book that's still studied in business schools today. Sun Tzu's The Art of War is only about 6,000 Chinese characters, another deceptively short text with endless depth. All warfare is based on deception. Know your enemy and know yourself, and you need not fear the result of 100 battles. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Sun Tzu understood that war is just politics by other means, that psychological advantage matters more than brute force. Finally, in 221 BCE, one state conquered all the others, the Qin state, ruled by a man who would become Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. He didn't want to be called a king. That was too small. He created a new title, Huang Di, the Emperor. And he didn't just unite China militarily, he standardized everything. Currency became uniform across all territories. Weights and measures were standardized. Even the width of cart axles was regulated so that ruts in roads would be consistent. But his most ambitious standardization was writing. Different regions had developed different character variations. Qin Shi Huang ordered the script standardized. One way to write each character. This made administration possible across vast distances, but it also meant the emperor could control thought by controlling language. Qin Shi Huang was terrified of death. He sent expeditions to find islands where immortals supposedly lived, hoping they would bring back the elixir of eternal life. He took mercury compounds that alchemists told him would grant immortality. They probably killed him. He died at age 49, likely from mercury poisoning, having spent enormous resources trying to avoid the one thing no one avoids. But he prepared for death anyway. He began building his tomb the day he became king at age 13. For 36 years, 700,000 workers labored on his mausoleum. The tomb itself has never been opened. Historical texts say it contains a model of his empire with rivers of mercury flowing mechanically. Sensors have detected unusual mercury levels in the soil above the tomb, suggesting the accounts might be true. What has been excavated is the army guarding the tomb, the Terracotta Army. Over 8,000 life-size soldiers have been uncovered so far, and there are probably more still buried. Each soldier has a unique face, individualized features, different expressions. Along with soldiers, there are horses, chariots, acrobats, musicians, an entire empire in clay, serving the emperor in death. The Great Wall that tourists visit today is mostly from the Ming Dynasty, built over 1,000 years after the Qin. But Qin Shi Huang connected and expanded earlier walls built by the warring states. He wanted a barrier against the nomadic tribes to the north, the Xiongnu, who would later migrate west and become the Huns who terrified Rome. The wall eventually stretched over 13,000 miles when all branches are included. Millions of workers built it over 2,000 years. Millions died building it. The wall is sometimes called the longest cemetery in the world. After the Qin collapsed under the weight of its own harshness, the Han dynasty took over in 206 BCE. The Han would rule for 400 years, with a brief interruption until 220 CE. This dynasty established the Silk Road, connecting China to Rome. Silk moved west, gold and silver moved east, but more importantly, ideas moved both ways. Buddhism came to China from India, grapes and alfalfa came to China from Central Asia. China's influence spread. Silk production was China's most closely guarded secret. Revealing how silk was made was punishable by death. For centuries, Rome and Persia and other Western nations paid enormous sums for silk without knowing it came from moth larvae. The Chinese monopoly on silk continued for thousands of years until, according to legend, a Chinese princess smuggled silkworm eggs out of the country in her elaborate headdress when she married a foreign prince. In 105 CE, a Han court official named Kai Lun invented paper, or possibly he just improved and standardized a process that already existed. Before paper, Chinese scholars wrote on bamboo strips bound with string, bulky and heavy, or they wrote on silk, which was expensive. Paper could be made from tree bark, hemp, Old fishing nets? Rags. It was cheap. It was light. It revolutionized record keeping, literature, and administration. Knowledge became more accessible because the medium for recording it became affordable. Chinese medicine developed based on the concept of QE, the life force flowing through the body along channels called meridians. Acupuncture involved inserting fine needles at specific points to redirect QE and restore balance. Han Dynasty texts describe 365 acupuncture points, matching the number of days in a year. The human body is a microcosm of the cosmos. Whether acupuncture works through the mechanisms traditional Chinese medicine describes or through other biological pathways is debated, but it's been practiced for over 2,000 years. The compass was invented by Chinese alchemists who discovered that lodestone, a naturally magnetized mineral, would align itself north to south. The first compasses were spoon-shaped pieces of lodestone balanced on a smooth bronze plate. But they weren't used for navigation. They were used for feng shui, for orienting buildings in harmony with the landscape, for fortune telling. Only centuries later did anyone think to use the compass for sailing. Gunpowder was another accidental discovery by alchemists seeking immortality elixirs. Mix saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal in the right proportions, and you get a powder that burns extremely fast, producing huge volumes of gas. Early gunpowder was weak, used for fireworks and signals. The Chinese invented rockets by packing gunpowder in bamboo tubes, beautiful displays lighting up the night sky. It took several centuries before anyone used gunpowder for weapons, and even then, early firearms were less effective than bows. But the principle, once discovered, would transform warfare worldwide. As the Han Dynasty declined, China fragmented again, but even in chaos, Chinese civilization continued. The written language unified people who spoke mutually unintelligible dialects. Confucian philosophy provided a shared ethical framework. The concept of China as the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization, persisted through every dynasty change. The Great Wall winds over mountains in the moonlight tonight, just as it has for 2,000 years. Watchtowers stand empty. The wall never really worked. As a defensive barrier, it was too long to defend every point. But it worked as a symbol, a statement that China ended here, that beyond was the realm of barbarians, a line drawn against chaos. And tonight, as you drift toward sleep, the same moon rising over China illuminates other lands where civilizations were dreaming different dreams. Westward across mountains and seas, where another people were learning to ask questions that would reshape how humanity thinks, where philosophy became not just wisdom, but a method, where democracy was born, imperfect but revolutionary, where stories told 3,000 years ago still move us to tears. Begin with the Aegean Sea, impossibly blue under the Mediterranean sun. Islands scattered, like stepping stones between continents, and on the largest island, Crete, around 2000 BCE, Europe's first advanced civilization emerged. The Minoans built a palace at Knossos that seems almost modern in its sophistication. The Palace of Knossos had running water. Terracotta pipes carried water from the mountains into the palace, where it flowed through bathrooms and fountains. Some rooms had flush toilets that emptied into a sewage system. There was even a ventilation system, carefully designed airways that kept rooms cool in summer. This was 3,500 years ago, Remember, most European cities wouldn't have this level of comfort until the modern era. The palace walls were covered in frescoes, showing a world that seems almost dreamlike. Women in elaborate dresses with exposed breasts, their hair piled in complex styles, gesturing in conversation. Men leaping over charging bulls in an athletic display that must have been as dangerous as it looks. Dolphins swimming through blue waves, gardens filled with flowers. The Minoans loved beauty and weren't afraid to show it. The bull leaping frescoes show a ritual sport that archaeologists still debate. Young athletes, male and female, would grab the horns of a charging bull and flip over its back in a somersault, landing behind it. Some scholars think this was religious ceremony. Others think it was entertainment. Either way, it required extraordinary courage and skill. One mistake, and the bull would gore you or trample you to death. Around 1450 BCE, something catastrophic happened. Most Minoan settlements on Crete were destroyed. The palace at Knossos burned. For years, archaeologists thought this was conquest, but now we know something else occurred. About 110 kilometers north of Crete, on the island of Thera, a volcano exploded. The Thera eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in human history. It ejected an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. The explosion was heard across the Mediterranean. Tsunamis radiated outward, waves up to 40 meters tall, slamming into Crete's northern coast. Ash fell like black snow across the region. The sky darkened for months, maybe years. Crops failed. Minoan civilization never fully recovered. Some scholars think the Thera eruption inspired the legend of Atlantis. Plato wrote about Atlantis 1,000 years after the eruption, describing an advanced island civilization destroyed in a single day and night. The details don't match perfectly, but the echo is there. A sophisticated maritime culture suddenly gone, leaving only ruins and memory. After the Minoans weakened, the Mycenaeans rose on mainland Greece. They built massive stone fortresses on hilltops, protected by walls made of stones so large that later Greeks couldn't believe humans had moved them. They called these walls Cyclopean, meaning built by Cyclops, the one-eyed giants of myth. Some stones in these walls weigh over 20 tons, fitted together without mortar. The Mycenaeans were warriors. Their tombs contain bronze swords, spear points, daggers with gold inlaid handles. One tomb, the so-called Tomb of Agamemnon, has a doorway topped by a lintel stone weighing 120 tons. Inside, the ceiling rises in a corbelled dome, each ring of stones projecting inward until they meet at the top. Standing in that tomb, you feel the weight of stone above you, the darkness, the sense of entering another world. The Trojan War probably happened during the Mycenaean period, around 1200 BCE. Whether it happened exactly as Homer described it, 400 years later, is doubtful, but there was a city called Troy in what is now Turkey. Archaeologists have found 9 cities built one on top of another at the site. Troy Zevon, the 7th layer, shows evidence of destruction by fire around 1180 BCE. Skeletons with violent injuries, arrowheads embedded in walls. Something terrible happened there. After 1200 BCE, the Mycenaean civilization collapsed. We don't know exactly why. Possibly earthquakes, possibly drought, possibly invasions by the mysterious sea peoples who were disrupting civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean. Whatever the cause, The palaces burned. The writing system was lost. Greece entered a dark age that lasted 400 years. During these dark centuries, Greece forgot how to write. No written records survive from this period. People lived in small villages, farming and herding. The great palaces became ruins, already ancient and mysterious, but oral tradition survived. Bards recited epic poems from memory, poems about heroes and gods, about the Trojan War and Odysseus's wandering journey home. These poems, passed down through generations, would eventually be written down as the Iliad and the Odyssey, attributed to a blind poet named Homer. Around 800 BCE, Greece began to recover. Writing returned, borrowed from the Phoenicians, but adapted for Greek. Instead of a syllabary, where each symbol represents a syllable, the Greeks created a true alphabet where symbols represent individual sounds. This made writing much easier to learn. Literacy could spread beyond a tiny elite of scribes. Greek cities began to coalesce into independent city-states called polis. Each polis was self-governing, often hostile to its neighbors. Athens and Sparta developed into the two most powerful, but they could not have been more different. Athens valued democracy, philosophy, art, and commerce. Sparta valued military discipline above everything else. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 and raised in brutal training camps, learning to endure pain and hardship. They slept on reed mats without blankets. They were deliberately given insufficient food, forced to steal to survive. Those who got caught were beaten, not for stealing, but for getting caught. Athens invented democracy around 508 BCE under the leadership of a reformer named Cleisthenes. It wasn't democracy as we understand it. Only free adult male citizens could participate. Women couldn't vote. Slaves couldn't vote. Foreign residents couldn't vote. But for those who qualified, it was revolutionary. Citizens gathered in assembly to debate and vote on laws. Anyone could speak. Decisions were made by majority vote. For the first time in history, ordinary people had political power. The Olympic Games began in 776 BCE, held every 4 years at Olympia in honor of Zeus. During the Games, a sacred truce was declared. All warfare stopped. Safe passage was guaranteed to athletes and spectators traveling to Olympia. The games included running, wrestling, boxing, chariot racing, and the pentathlon. Athletes competed completely naked, their bodies oiled and gleaming in the sun. Married women were forbidden to watch the games on penalty of death. Though unmarried women could attend, the penalty was never actually enforced because only one woman ever violated the rule. Her son was competing, and she disguised herself as his trainer to watch him. When he won, she jumped over the barrier in excitement, and her disguise fell away. The judges pardoned her because her father, brothers, and son were all Olympic champions. After that, trainers had to attend naked too to prevent further deception. In 490 BCE, the Persian Empire invaded Greece. Persia was the superpower of the ancient world, controlling territory from Egypt to India. Tiny Greece should have been crushed. At the Battle of Marathon, 10,000 Athenian hoplites faced a Persian army of about 25,000. The Greeks formed a phalanx, overlapping shields creating a wall, long spears projecting forward. They held the center thin, but strengthened both wings. The Persians broke through the center, then the Greek wings closed in from both sides, encircling them. The Persians fled to their ships. The Greeks killed 6,400 Persians while losing only 192 of their own men. After the battle, a messenger named Pheticpides ran from Marathon to Athens, a distance of about 42 kilometers, to bring news of victory. He arrived, gasped out, "We won," and collapsed dead from exhaustion. Modern marathon races commemorate his run, though the modern marathon distance of 42.195 kilometers was standardized much later and has nothing to do with the actual distance Pheticpides ran. 10 years later, Persia invaded again with an even larger army. At Thermopylae, a narrow pass between mountains and sea, 300 Spartan warriors under King Leonidas held off the entire Persian army for 3 days. They died to the last man, but bought time for Greece to prepare its defense. Leonidas knew it was a suicide mission. Before leaving Sparta, when someone told his wife to marry a good man and bear good children after he died, she replied that she would marry a good man, but no children could be as good as the one they already had. The Spartans fought not because they expected to win, but because duty required it. The Golden Age of Athens followed the Persian Wars. Under Pericles, Athens became the cultural center of the Greek world. The Parthenon was built between 447 and 432 BCE, a temple to Athena on the Acropolis Hill overlooking the city. The building looks simple, just columns supporting a triangular roof, but every line is slightly curved. The columns bulge slightly in the middle, correcting for an optical illusion that would make straight columns look concave from a distance. The floor curves upward in the center. The corner columns are slightly thicker. Nothing is perfectly straight because perfect straightness would look wrong. The architects understood human perception and built accordingly. The Parthenon was originally painted in bright colors. The pediments, the triangular spaces under the roof, contained elaborate sculptures painted in reds, blues, and golds. A 12-meter tall statue of Athena stood inside, covered in gold and ivory. When Renaissance Europeans excavated Greek ruins centuries later and found only white marble, they assumed Greek art was colorless. This influenced European art for centuries. The truth is that ancient Greece was vibrant with color. Time and weather stripped the paint away, leaving only stone. Greek theater emerged as a major art form. Tragedies by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides explored profound moral questions through stories of gods and heroes. Comedies by Aristophanes mocked politicians and social pretensions with bawdy humor. Plays were performed in massive outdoor amphitheaters carved into hillsides. The theater of Epidaurus could seat 14,000 people, and the acoustics were so perfect that an actor speaking normally in the center could be heard clearly in the back row. Even today, you can drop a coin in the orchestra and hear it ring clearly from the top seats. The Greek philosophy began with people asking a simple question that sounds almost stupid. What is everything made of? Thales said water, Anaximenes said air, Heraclitus said fire, that everything flows and changes. These answers were wrong, but the question was revolutionary. Instead of saying the gods made everything and leaving it at that, Greeks started looking for natural explanations. They invented the concept of investigating the world through reason. Socrates took philosophy in a new direction. He didn't care about physics or cosmology. He cared about how to live well. He wandered the marketplace of Athens, engaging anyone who would talk with him in conversation. He asked questions. What is justice? What is courage? What is piety? His method was to pretend ignorance and keep asking questions until his conversation partner contradicted themselves or admitted they didn't really know what they were talking about. This annoyed people. In 399 BCE, Socrates was put on trial for corrupting the youth and not believing in the city's gods. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. He could have escaped. His friends arranged it. He refused. He had lived his entire life as an Athenian citizen, benefiting from the city's laws. To disobey those laws now, even when they were wrongly applied, would be hypocrisy. So at age 70, he drank a cup of hemlock poison. His last words, according to Plato, were Credo, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Pay the debt, and don't forget. Asclepius was the god of healing. Socrates might have meant that death cures the disease of life, that he was finally being healed. Plato, Socrates' student, founded the academy in Athens around 387 BCE. It was the world's first university, teaching philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. Above the entrance was supposedly written, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." The academy operated for over 900 years until it was closed by the Christian Byzantine Emperor Justinian in 529 CE, who considered it pagan. For 9 centuries, people came from across the Mediterranean world to learn at the academy. Aristotle studied at Plato's academy for 20 years, then left to become tutor to a Macedonian prince who would become Alexander the Great. Aristotle's curiosity was encyclopedic. He wrote about physics, metaphysics, logic, ethics, politics, biology, zoology, poetry, and rhetoric. He dissected animals to understand their anatomy. He classified living things. He created formal logic, the systematic study of correct reasoning. His works became the foundation of medieval European philosophy and remained authoritative for centuries. Alexander the Great inherited the throne of Macedon at age 20 and spent the next 13 years conquering everything between Greece and India. He defeated the Persian Empire. He was declared Pharaoh of Egypt. He founded cities across Asia, many named Alexandria after himself. At age 33, he fell ill with a fever and died in Babylon. His empire immediately fragmented, carved up by his generals, but Greek culture spread across the territories he had conquered. This Hellenistic period saw Greek language, art, and philosophy mix with local traditions throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. In Alexandria, Egypt, one of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy, founded a library with the ambition of collecting every book in the world. Scholars traveled to Alexandria, bringing manuscripts. Ships arriving in the harbor had their books confiscated, copied, and returned. At its peak, the Library of Alexandria may have held 400,000 scrolls. It was gradually destroyed over several centuries through various fires and conflicts. What knowledge was lost, we can only guess. The library represented an attempt to gather all human knowledge in one place, a beautiful, impossible dream. Greek mathematics reached extraordinary heights. Pythagoras, who lived around 500 BCE, discovered the theorem about right triangles that bears his name, though he may have learned it from Babylonians. Euclid wrote the Elements around 300 BCE, a systematic treatment of geometry that remained the standard textbook for over 2,000 years. His method of starting with basic assumptions and deriving everything through logical proof became the model for mathematical reasoning. Archimedes of Syracuse was perhaps the greatest mathematician of antiquity. He calculated pi accurately to several decimal places. He discovered the principle of buoyancy while taking a bath, supposedly jumping out and running naked through the streets, shouting Eureka, meaning I have found it. He invented war machines to defend Syracuse from Roman siege, including enormous catapults and a claw that could lift attacking ships out of the water and smash them against rocks. In 212 BCE, Roman soldiers finally breached Syracuse's walls. Archimedes was working on a mathematical problem, drawing geometric figures in the sand. A Roman soldier approached him. Archimedes, absorbed in his calculations, waved him away, saying, "Do not disturb my circles." The soldier, not recognizing one of the ancient world's greatest minds, killed him on the spot. He was 75 years old. His last thoughts were of mathematics. Greek astronomy was remarkably sophisticated. Aristarchus of Samos proposed around 270 BCE that the earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. He was ignored because the idea seemed absurd. Obviously, the earth stood still and everything else moved around it. It would take 1,800 years before Copernicus revived the heliocentric model. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth around 240 BCE with remarkable accuracy. He knew that at noon on the summer solstice in Syene, modern Aswan, the sun was directly overhead. At the same time in Alexandria, about 800 kilometers north, the sun cast a shadow at an angle of about 7 degrees. He used simple geometry to calculate that the Earth's circumference must be about 40,000 kilometers. The actual circumference is 40,075 kilometers. He was off by less than 1%, using nothing but shadows, geometry, and brilliance. The Greeks gave us tragedy and comedy, democracy and philosophy, the Olympic Games and the alphabet. They gave us the idea that humans could understand the world through reason rather than just accepting what priests and kings told them. They asked questions that had never been asked before, or at least never asked so systematically. What is justice? What is the good life? How should we organize society? What is the nature of reality? But Greece was never unified. The city-states fought each other constantly. Athens and Sparta fought the Peloponnesian War for 27 years, exhausting both sides. Macedon under Philip II conquered Greece in 338 BCE, and his son Alexander spread Greek culture across 3 continents. But after Alexander's death, the Greek world fragmented again into successor kingdoms ruled by Macedonian dynasties. These Hellenistic kingdoms gradually fell to Rome. The last was Ptolemaic Egypt, which ended in 30 BCE when Cleopatra VII committed suicide after losing a war with Octavian, soon to become Emperor Augustus. Greece became a Roman province, politically subjugated but culturally dominant. Educated Romans learned Greek, read Greek literature, studied Greek philosophy. Rome conquered Greece militarily, but Greece conquered Rome culturally. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the Aegean Sea at dusk, islands dark against the water, the ruins of the Parthenon on its hill, columns still standing after 2,500 years. The theater at Epidaurus, where you can still hear a whisper from the stage. The Greeks are gone, but their questions remain. How should we live? What is justice? What makes a good society? Every generation must answer these questions anew. The Greek world eventually faded into the Roman Empire, which would take the Greek love of beauty and philosophy and combine it with Roman engineering and organization to create something even larger. An empire that would stretch from Britain to Mesopotamia, that would build roads and aqueducts still standing today, that would spread a common language and law across half the known world. Legend says that Rome was founded in 753 BCE by Romulus, who was raised by a she-wolf along with his twin brother Remus. The brothers quarreled about where to build their city. Romulus killed Remus and founded Rome on the Palatine Hill, one of 7 hills beside the Tiber River. It's a violent origin story for a civilization that would build itself through relentless violence and somehow turn that violence into lasting peace. The Romans believed they descended from Aeneas, a Trojan prince who escaped when Troy fell. Virgil's Aeneid tells how Aeneas wandered the Mediterranean, like Odysseus, eventually landing in Italy and founding the line that would lead to Romulus. This connected Rome to Greek mythology, giving Romans a noble pedigree, even as they were conquering Greek territories. Rome began as a monarchy, then became a republic around 509 BCE when the last king was overthrown. The Roman Republic was governed by 2 consuls elected annually, advised by the Senate, a body of aristocrats who held power through wealth and family connections. It wasn't democracy like Athens, it was oligarchy, ruled by the wealthy, but there were checks and balances. The people could elect tribunes to protect their interests. Laws had to be publicly displayed. Citizens had some rights, though those rights varied enormously by social class. The Republic expanded slowly at first, conquering Italy through a combination of military force and clever alliances. Rome didn't just defeat enemies, it offered them deals: become our ally, supply soldiers for our army, and you can keep your local government and customs. Many Italian cities accepted. Those who resisted were crushed. By 270 BCE, Rome controlled the entire Italian peninsula. Then came the Punic Wars, 3 massive conflicts with Carthage, the dominant naval power in the western Mediterranean. Carthage was a Phoenician colony in North Africa, controlling trade routes and wealthy colonies in Sicily, Spain, and Sardinia. Rome and Carthage were competing powers in too small a space. War was inevitable. The Second Punic War, from 218 to 201 BCE, nearly destroyed Rome. Hannibal Barca, Carthage's brilliant general, did something no one thought possible. He marched an army from Spain across southern Gaul, over the Alps, into Italy in the middle of winter, with war elephants. Crossing the Alps cost Hannibal half his army. Soldiers froze to death in mountain passes. Elephants slipped on ice and fell into crevasses. But Hannibal made it to Italy and spent the next 15 years defeating Roman army after Roman army. At Cannae in 216 BCE, he encircled and annihilated a Roman force of 80,000 men using only 50,000 of his own. It remains one of the most studied military victories in history. But Hannibal couldn't take Rome itself. The city's walls were too strong, and Roman allies mostly stayed loyal. Eventually, Rome sent an army to attack Carthage directly, forcing Hannibal to sail home to defend his own city. In 202 BCE, at the Battle of Zama, Hannibal was defeated. Carthage was forced to surrender all its territories and pay massive tribute to Rome. 50 years later, Rome decided Carthage was still a threat and attacked again in the Third Punic War. After a 3 year siege, Roman soldiers broke through Carthage's walls and spent 6 days killing everyone they could find. The city was systematically demolished. According to legend, though probably not true, the Romans plowed the ruins with salt so nothing would ever grow there again. Carthage was erased, not just defeated, but annihilated as a warning to anyone who challenged Rome. By 146 BCE, Rome controlled the entire western Mediterranean. The eastern Mediterranean, the wealthy Hellenistic kingdoms descended from Alexander's empire, fell next. Conquest brought incredible wealth to Rome: gold, silver, art, slaves, grain, but it also brought social upheaval. Soldiers returned from decades of war to find their small farms had been bought up by wealthy senators who now owned vast estates worked by slaves. The gap between rich and poor widened. Politicians competed for power by promising reforms to help the poor or by offering free grain and entertainment to the urban masses. Political violence became common. Reformers were murdered by conservative senators who didn't want change. Into this chaos stepped military strongmen. Marius reformed the army, recruiting the poorest citizens and promising them land after service. Now soldiers were loyal to their generals, who gave them rewards, not to the abstract concept of Rome. Sulla marched an army on Rome itself, setting a terrible precedent. Civil war became routine. Julius Caesar was a brilliant general who spent 8 years conquering Gaul, modern France. His commentaries on the Gallic War are military reports written in elegant Latin, documenting campaigns, battles, and the subjugation of millions. He crossed the Rhine into Germany and the Channel into Britain, going where no Roman army had gone before. He killed an estimated 1 million Gauls and enslaved another million. It was genocide dressed as civilization. In 49 BCE, the Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome. He knew this was a trap. Without his army, his political enemies would prosecute and probably execute him. So he made a choice. He led his army south, crossing the Rubicon River, the boundary between Gaul and Italy. Roman law forbade generals from bringing armies across the Rubicon. To cross it meant rebellion. As he crossed, Caesar supposedly said, "Alia Acata est." The die is cast. He was gambling everything. Civil war followed. Caesar defeated his rivals, becoming dictator for life. He had enormous power and used it to pass reforms. He reorganized the calendar, creating the Julian calendar with 365 days and a leap year every 4 years. Our calendar today is directly descended from Caesar's, with only minor modifications. He granted citizenship to people in the provinces. He planned colonies for poor Romans and discharged soldiers. But many senators feared Caesar wanted to become king. On March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius, surrounded Caesar in the Senate and stabbed him 23 times. He died at the base of a statue of Pompey, his former rival and son-in-law. According to legend, his last words were "Et tu, Brute," meaning "even you, Brutus," though he probably actually said nothing, too busy dying. Caesar's assassination plunged Rome into another civil war. His adopted heir, his grandnephew Octavian, just 18 years old, outmaneuvered all rivals. By 31 BCE, after defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, Octavian controlled the entire Roman world, but he was smarter than Caesar. He didn't call himself king or dictator. He called himself princeps, first citizen. He took the honorific title Augustus, the revered one. He claimed to be restoring the republic while actually creating an empire. Augustus ruled for 40 years, bringing stability after a century of civil wars. This was the beginning of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, 2 centuries when the empire was mostly at peace internally. Wars continued on the frontiers, but within the empire, cities flourished, trade expanded, population grew. The Mediterranean became a Roman lake, safe for commerce because pirates had been eliminated, and a single legal system governed everywhere. Roman engineering was spectacular. Aqueducts carried water from mountains to cities. The Pont de Gard in France is a three-tiered aqueduct standing 49 meters tall, built entirely without mortar. Stones cut so precisely that they support themselves through weight and friction alone. Rome itself had 11 aqueducts supplying over 1 million cubic meters of water daily. That's more water per person than modern Rome has. The water-powered fountains filled bathhouses, flushed public toilets, and supplied private homes. Clean water was available to everyone, not just the rich. Roman roads connected the empire, over 250,000 miles of paved roads at the height. The saying, "all roads lead to Rome," was literally true. You could travel from Britain to Syria on Roman roads, sleeping in Roman inns, protected by Roman soldiers stationed at regular intervals. The roads were built to last, multiple layers of stone and gravel, carefully graded and drained. Some Roman roads are still in use today, 2,000 years later. Roman concrete was made with volcanic ash from around the Bay of Naples. This ash reacts with seawater to form minerals that make the concrete stronger over time, unlike modern concrete, which degrades. The Pantheon in Rome, completed in 126 CE, has a dome 43 meters in diameter, made entirely of unreinforced concrete. It remains the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. The oculus at the top, an open circle 9 meters across, is the only source of light. When it rains, water falls through the oculus onto the marble floor, draining through nearly invisible holes. The Colosseum, completed in 80 CE, could hold up to 50,000 spectators. It had a retractable awning to provide shade, operated by sailors from the Roman Navy using techniques from sailing ships. The floor of the arena could be removed, and the space underneath flooded with water for mock naval battles called naumachia, complete with ships and gladiators fighting as marines. Gladiator fights were brutal entertainment. Condemned criminals were thrown to wild animals. Captured enemies were forced to fight to the death, but trained gladiators were expensive to replace, so fights weren't always lethal. A defeated gladiator could appeal to the crowd for mercy. If the crowd shouted for life and the sponsor agreed, the gladiator survived to fight another day. Successful gladiators became celebrities, their images sold on pottery and lamps. Some won enough victories to buy their freedom and retire wealthy. Romans loved their bathhouses. The baths of Caracalla could accommodate 1,600 bathers at once. You entered through the gymnasium, where men exercised and played ball games. Then you moved through a series of rooms of different temperatures: the caldarium, hot and steamy; the tepidarium, warm; The frigidarium, cold plunge pool. You could get a massage, have slaves oil, and scrape your skin with a curved blade called a strigil, have your hair cut, conduct business, socialize. Bathhouses were social clubs, open to everyone, including women, though usually at separate times. The Roman army at its peak consisted of about 300,000 soldiers, legionaries, who were Roman citizens, and auxiliaries, who were non citizens from the provinces. Legionaries were professional soldiers who served for 20 to 25 years. They marched 20 Roman miles per day, about 30 kilometers, carrying 60 pounds of equipment. Each night they built a fortified camp with ditches and wooden palisades. In hostile territory, they built permanent forts of stone. Roman military discipline was legendary. If a unit fled from battle, decimation might be ordered. Every 10th man, chosen by lot, was beaten to death by his comrades. This sounds insane, punishing 9 innocent men to punish the guilty, but it meant soldiers feared their own army more than the enemy, which had a certain brutal logic. Decimation was rarely actually used, which suggests its threat alone was effective. In 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted, burying the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash and pumice. About 16,000 people died. The ash preserved everything: bread still in ovens, wine jars still sealed, graffiti on walls, bodies of people caught trying to flee, their shapes preserved as cavities in the hardened ash. When archaeologists pour plaster into these cavities, they create casts showing people in their final moments: a mother sheltering her child, a dog chained to a post, trying to climb higher as ash rose around it. The graffiti at Pompeii is remarkably human. Election slogans: vote for Lucius Papitius Sabinus, he keeps the streets clean. Declarations of love: Successus loves Iris with all his heart. Insults: Marcus loves Spendusa, but she doesn't care for him. And wonderfully complaints about graffiti. I wonder, O wall, that you have not yet collapsed under the weight of so much nonsense. Roman food culture was elaborate among the wealthy. Multi-course banquets lasting hours. Dormice stuffed with pork and nuts, considered a delicacy. Garum, a fermented fish sauce, on everything. Romans ate lying down on couches, arranged in a U shape around a central table. The host reclined at the bottom of the U, the most important guests at the top. Some banquets lasted 8 hours or more, with breaks where guests would induce vomiting so they could eat more. The vomitorium, though, wasn't a room for vomiting. It was an exit passage in amphitheaters. But the image of Roman decadence is based on some truth. Rome reached its greatest extent under Emperor Trajan around 117 CE, controlling territory from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine and Danube rivers to the Sahara Desert. Then came slow decline, so slow that people living through it probably didn't notice. The crisis of the 3rd century, from 235 to 284 CE, nearly destroyed the empire. In 50 years, Rome had 26 emperors. Most were murdered or killed in battle. The empire fragmented. Germanic tribes raided across the frontiers. The Persian Sassanid Empire attacked from the east. The economy collapsed. Inflation skyrocketed. Cities shrank. Long-distance trade declined. Somehow, Rome recovered. Diocletian and then Constantine restructured the empire, made it more militarized, more bureaucratic, more authoritarian. Constantine converted to Christianity, which had been a persecuted minority religion. Suddenly, Christianity was legal, then favored, then mandatory. The old gods were abandoned. Temples were closed or converted into churches. 1,000 years of religious tradition ended within a few generations. In 330 CE, Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople, modern Istanbul. The center of power shifted east. Rome became a backwater, still symbolically important, but politically irrelevant. In 410 CE, Visigothic warriors under Alaric sacked Rome. For the first time in 800 years, a foreign enemy had captured the city. Romans were shocked. Some thought it was the end of the world. Saint Augustine wrote The City of God partly to explain how Rome could fall if God favored Christians. The Western Roman Empire continued to decay. Germanic tribes established kingdoms within former Roman territory. In 476 CE, a Germanic chieftain deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. Historians mark this as the end of the Western Roman Empire, though contemporaries probably didn't notice much difference. The institutions had already eroded. The empire had become a fiction maintained by inertia. But the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, continued for another 1,000 years until Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Byzantines considered themselves Romans. They spoke Greek, but their official documents called them Romans. The Senate continued to meet in Constantinople. Roman law continued to develop. When we say the Roman Empire fell in 476, we're ignoring the half that survived and thrived for another millennium. Roman ruins stand today across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Aqueducts, amphitheaters, bathhouses, roads, walls, triumphal arches. Every ruin is a reminder that nothing lasts forever. Rome believed it was eternal. Romans called their city the Eternal City. They believed their empire would last until the end of time. But empires are built by humans and fall like humans fall. Time takes everything. Yet Rome's legacy persists. Romance languages descended from Latin. Legal concepts from Roman law underpin Western legal systems. The idea of citizenship, of rights and duties, comes from Rome. The Catholic Church preserved Latin and Roman administrative structures through the Middle Ages. Even the architecture of government buildings, columns and domes in marble, imitates Rome. As moonlight falls on Roman columns tonight, it illuminates stones that have stood for 2,000 years. The forum where senators debated is silent now, tourists walking where emperors once walked. But in that silence, you can almost hear the echoes. The rhetoric of Cicero, the marching of legions, the roar of crowds in the Colosseum. Rome fell, but it never quite disappeared. It transformed, pieces of it embedded in everything that came after. While Rome built its empire around the Mediterranean, across the ocean in lands Romans never knew existed, other civilizations were rising, building their own pyramids, developing their own writing, creating their own empires, completely isolated from the old world, following parallel paths toward complexity and grandeur. Close your eyes and imagine this. While Greece was fighting Persia, while Rome was conquering Carthage, while Chinese dynasties rose and fell, entire civilizations flourished across the ocean that no one knew how to cross. The Americas developed in complete isolation from Africa, Europe, and Asia for over 10,000 years after the last ice age. Everything they built without influence from the old world. No wheels for transportation, no horses or cattle, no iron tools. Yet they created cities, empires, and monuments that rivaled anything in the ancient world. The Olmec emerged around 1200 BCE in the tropical lowlands of Mexico along the Gulf Coast. They're called the mother culture of Mesoamerica because so much of what came after seems to descend from them. The Olmec built ceremonial centers with earthen pyramids. They developed a writing system, though we can't read it. They created a calendar. They played a ritual ball game in stone courts. But the Olmec are most famous for their colossal heads. 17 have been found so far, massive sculptures of human heads carved from single blocks of basalt. Some weigh up to 50 tons. The nearest source of basalt is in the Tuxtla Mountains, 60 miles away from where the heads were found. The Olmec moved these enormous stones across swamps and rivers without wheels or draft animals, probably using log rollers and rafts. The effort involved is almost incomprehensible. The faces on the colossal heads are distinctive. Broad noses, thick lips, helmets or headdresses unique to each head. Some people have argued the faces look African, sparking controversial theories about transatlantic contact in ancient times. The mainstream archaeological view is that the heads represent Olmec rulers, and the facial features are indigenous to the region. But the mystery adds to their power. These massive stone faces stare out from museum halls and jungle clearings, expressions serene, keeping whatever secrets they hold. The Olmec civilization declined around 400 BCE, but their influence spread. The calendar, the writing, the ball game, the art style, all of it was adopted and adapted by later Mesoamerican cultures. The Maya emerged in the Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. Maya civilization reached its peak during what's called the Classic Period, from about 250 to 900 CE. At their height, Maya cities were home to millions. Tikal alone had a population around 100,000, with another 400,000 living in the surrounding area. The Maya pyramids rose above the jungle canopy, temples climbing toward the sky. The pyramids weren't tombs like Egyptian pyramids. They were platforms for temples where priests performed rituals and sacrifices. At Chichen Itza, the pyramid called El Castillo has 365 steps, one for each day of the solar year. During the spring and autumn equinoxes, the angle of the sun creates a shadow that looks like a serpent descending the pyramid's staircase. Whether this was intentional or coincidence, it's a stunning effect. Maya astronomy was incredibly sophisticated. They tracked the movements of Venus with precision, knowing its cycle to within hours over decades. They could predict solar and lunar eclipses. Their calendar was more accurate than the European calendar of the same period. The Maya calculated that a solar year was 365.2420 days long. The actual length is 365.2422 days. They were off by only 17 seconds per year. The Maya used multiple calendars simultaneously. The Salkin was a 260-day sacred calendar. The Hab was a 365-day solar calendar. These two calendars meshed like gears, creating a 52-year cycle called the calendar round. Beyond that was the long count, tracking days from a mythological creation date in 3114 BCE. The famous 2012 doomsday prediction was based on a misunderstanding of the long count calendar completing a cycle, which Maya texts never suggest meant the end of the world, just the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. Maya mathematics used a base 20 system and included the concept of zero. They invented zero independently from the old world, representing it with a shell symbol. This is remarkable because zero is not an obvious concept. It's the absence of quantity, the nothing that must be something in order to serve as a placeholder in positional notation. Only a few cultures in history independently discovered zero. Maya writing was the most sophisticated in the pre-Columbian Americas. It used over 800 glyphs, combining logograms that represent whole words and syllabic signs that represent sounds. One word could be written multiple ways using different combinations of glyphs, allowing for artistic variation and wordplay. Maya scribes were artists as well as writers, creating texts that were both literature and visual art. Thousands of Maya books existed, bark paper folded accordion style and covered in glyphs. Only four survive. When Spanish conquistadors and priests arrived in the 1500s, they systematically destroyed Maya books as pagan and demonic. Diego de Landa, a Franciscan bishop, organized a massive book burning in 1562. We found a large number of books in these characters, he wrote, and as they contained nothing in which were not to be seen as superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all. One of history's great acts of cultural genocide. We'll never know what knowledge, what stories, what history turned to ash. The four surviving Maya books are called codices. The Dresden Codex contains astronomical tables predicting eclipses and the movements of Venus. The complexity of the mathematics involved suggests the Maya were doing calculations we wouldn't match until the development of modern astronomy. Around 900 CE, the great Maya cities of the southern lowlands were abandoned. Populations collapsed. New construction stopped. Jungle reclaimed the pyramids. What happened remains debated. Drought is the leading theory. Tree ring data shows severe droughts in the region between 800 and 1000 CE. When the rains fail in tropical agriculture, civilization becomes impossible. Wars might have intensified as cities competed for dwindling resources. Political systems might have collapsed, but whatever the cause, the classic Maya civilization ended, though Maya people survived in smaller settlements, and the northern cities continued for several more centuries. While the Maya flourished in the lowlands, another civilization was rising in the highlands of central Mexico. The Aztecs, or more properly the Mexica, arrived in the Valley of Mexico as a poor nomadic tribe in the 1200 CE. According to their legend, their god Huitzilopochtli told them to wander until they found an eagle perched on a cactus, eating a snake. In 1325 CE, they saw this sign on a swampy island in Lake Texcoco. When Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519, Tenochtitlan was one of the largest cities in the world, with about 200,000 inhabitants. It was built on an island connected to shore by causeways. Canals served as streets, boats moving between buildings like the later Venice. Fresh water flowed to the city through aqueducts. The central plaza contained temples, palaces, and markets. The Spanish were astonished by what they saw. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier with Cortés, wrote, "When we saw so many cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land, We were amazed and said that it was like the enchantments they tell of in the legend of Amadis, on account of the great towers and temples and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. The market at Tlaco, Tenochtitlan's sister city, was vast. 60,000 people came to trade every 5 days. You could buy food, clothing, jewelry, pottery, tools, slaves, live animals, medicinal plants, and more. Everything had a fixed price. Judges sat in the market to resolve disputes. It was organized, efficient, and enormous. Aztec agriculture was brilliant. They built chinampas, artificial islands, in the shallow lake. They wove branches and reeds into large rafts, piled mud and vegetation on top, and anchored them to the lake bottom with willows whose roots held everything together. The chinampas were incredibly fertile, irrigated by the lake water, producing up to 7 harvests per year. The Aztecs fed a city of 200,000, largely through this intensive agriculture. But Aztec religion was built around blood. They believed the sun required human blood to rise each day. Without constant human sacrifice, the universe would end. Captured warriors were the preferred victims, dying on top of pyramids, their hearts cut out with obsidian knives while still beating. The bodies were thrown down the pyramid steps. The Aztecs sacrificed thousands of people annually. When the Spanish arrived with their own brutal practices, they were nevertheless horrified by Aztec sacrifice. Both cultures were violent, but Aztec violence was ritualized in ways that shocked Europeans. The Aztec calendar stone, often called the Sunstone, is one of the most recognizable artifacts from ancient America. It's a massive circular carving, 3.6 meters in diameter, weighing 24 tons. At the center is the sun god Tenati, tongue sticking out, holding human hearts. Around him are symbols representing the 4 previous worlds, each destroyed by different catastrophes. The Aztecs believed they lived in the fifth world, which would eventually be destroyed by earthquakes. The stone combines calendar, cosmology, and theology into a single stunning work of art. The Aztec Empire ended abruptly. Cortés arrived with only a few hundred Spanish soldiers, but he had advantages the Aztecs couldn't overcome: steel weapons and armor, horses which terrified people who had never seen such animals, gunpowder weapons, and most devastatingly, diseases. Smallpox swept through Tenochtitlan, killing thousands, including the emperor. The Aztecs had no immunity to old world diseases. In 1521, after a siege, the Spanish captured Tenochtitlan. They demolished it and built Mexico City on the ruins. The Aztec Empire, which had dominated central Mexico for less than 200 years, was gone. Far to the south, in the Andes Mountains of South America, the Inca Empire was rising. The Inca called their empire Tawantinsuyu, meaning the 4 regions. At its peak in the early 1500s, the empire stretched 2,500 miles from modern Ecuador through Peru to Chile and Argentina. It was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, possibly 10 million people under Inca rule. The Inca built an extensive road system, about 25,000 miles of roads connecting the empire. Mountain roads were carved into cliff faces, with stone steps climbing impossible slopes. Bridges spanned canyons, woven from grass ropes. These suspension bridges could stretch up to 150 feet, swaying in the wind but strong enough for llamas and people to cross. Each bridge was rebuilt annually in a community ceremony, everyone helping to weave new ropes and repair the structure. Messages traveled the roads, carried by runners called chasqui. Relay stations were placed every mile or two. Your runner would sprint to the next station, hand off the message, and rest while a fresh runner continued. This system could move information 150 miles in a day, faster than horseback in that terrain. The Inca emperor could eat fresh fish brought from the coast to his palace in Cusco, 200 miles away in the mountains, because runners brought it packed in ice, relaying it up the mountains before it spoiled. Machu Picchu is the most famous Inca site, though it was probably just a royal estate, not a major city. Built around 1450 CE on a mountain ridge, it's accessible only by steep paths. The Spanish never found it, so it survived intact until American historian Hiram Bingham publicized it in 1911. The stonework is extraordinary. Blocks cut so precisely that they fit together without mortar, edges so tight you can't slide a knife blade between them. Some blocks have dozens of angles fitting against neighboring blocks in complex three-dimensional puzzles. How the Inca achieved this precision without iron tools remains partly mysterious. They used bronze and stone tools, perhaps with sand as an abrasive, but the skill involved is remarkable. The Inca had no writing system, at least not as we understand it. Instead, they used quipu, knotted strings for record keeping. A quipu consists of a primary cord with colored strings hanging from it. Knots tied at different positions on the strings encoded information. Different colors meant different categories. The position of knots indicated place values in a decimal system. Quipus recorded census data, tribute payments, astronomical observations, possibly even narratives, and history that we're not sure about the last part because we can't fully read quipus. Hundreds of quipus survive, but their meaning is largely lost. We can read the numbers because the decimal system is clear, but the narrative content, if it exists, remains mysterious. When the Spanish conquered the Inca, they destroyed most quipus and killed the Quipucamaics, the specialist readers, another case of knowledge lost through cultural destruction. The Inca practiced a form of freeze drying to preserve potatoes. They left potatoes on mountain peaks where they would freeze at night and bake in the sun by day. People would trample the potatoes to squeeze out moisture. After days of freezing and trampling, the potatoes became chuño, completely dehydrated. Chuño could be stored for years without spoiling. It was emergency food, insurance against famine. The technique is still used in the Andes today. In 1532, Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro arrived in Peru with fewer than 200 men and captured the Inca emperor Atahualpa through treachery. The Inca Empire was in the middle of a civil war between rival brothers. Atahualpa had just won, but the empire was weakened. Pizarro ambushed Atahualpa at a meeting using horses and guns to massacre the emperor's unarmed retinue. Pizarro held Atahualpa for ransom. The Inca filled a room with gold and two rooms with silver, one of the largest ransoms in history. Pizarro took the treasure and executed Atahualpa anyway. The empire, without its divine emperor and already weakened by disease and civil war, collapsed. Across the Americas, civilizations rose that we're only beginning to understand. The Nazca lines in Peru, enormous geoglyphs scratched into the desert, some running for miles, depicting animals and geometric patterns visible only from the air. Who made them and why remains debated. The Mississippian culture built Cahokia near modern St. Louis around 1000 CE, a city of perhaps 20,000 people with earthen pyramids and a sophisticated society. It was abandoned by 1400 for reasons we don't fully understand. The Americas before European contact were not an empty wilderness. They were filled with diverse cultures, languages, cities, and empires, millions of people living complex lives. The arrival of Europeans brought diseases that killed 90% of the indigenous population within a century. It was the largest demographic catastrophe in human history. The forests that European settlers thought were pristine wilderness were actually regrowing on abandoned farmland, land emptied by disease. The ancient Americans never developed the wheel for transportation, though they had wheeled toys. They never domesticated large animals for plowing or riding, though they had llamas and alpacas as pack animals. They worked mostly without metal tools, using stone, wood, and bone. Yet they built pyramids that still stand. They created mathematical and astronomical knowledge that rivaled or surpassed the old world. They fed millions through intensive agriculture. They built empires and wrote literature and made art. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine the view from Machu Picchu at dawn, mist filling the valleys between mountain peaks, the sun rising over ridges where the Inca once watched the same sunrise, measuring the year by the sun's position. They're gone now, but the stones remain. The terraces still hold back the mountain. The water channels still carry water, proof that humans can create beauty even in the most impossible places, and that beauty can outlast the civilization that made it. While empires rose and fell in the Americas, Asia was building its own magnificent civilizations, some lasting thousands of years, spreading philosophies and religions that would shape billions of lives. The East and West developed separately, occasionally touching through trade routes, each following its own path toward complexity and wisdom. The Mauryan Empire unified most of India around 320 BCE under Chandragupta Maurya. India had been fractured into competing kingdoms and republics. Chandragupta, possibly inspired by meeting Alexander the Great during Alexander's brief invasion of India, built an empire larger than Alexander's. He was advised by Chanakya, a brilliant strategist who wrote the Arthashastra, a text on statecraft so ruthlessly practical it makes Machiavelli look gentle. Chandragupta's grandson Ashoka inherited the empire and initially continued the family tradition of conquest. In 261 BCE, he invaded Kalinga, a kingdom on India's east coast. The war was brutal. According to Ashoka's own inscriptions, 100,000 people died in the fighting and 150,000 were deported. Standing on the battlefield after victory, surrounded by corpses, Ashoka felt profound remorse. He converted to Buddhism and spent the rest of his life promoting Dharma righteous living. He erected pillars across India, inscribed with edicts promoting nonviolence, tolerance, and compassion. The pillars were technological marvels, single pieces of polished sandstone up to 50 feet tall, transported hundreds of miles to their locations. Atop each pillar was a capital, often showing 4 lions standing back to back. This lion capital became India's national emblem, appearing on currency and government documents. Ashoka's edicts are remarkable documents. He promoted animal welfare, built hospitals, planted shade trees along roads, and dug wells for public use. He sent Buddhist missionaries across Asia, spreading Buddhism to Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and beyond. One edict says, "All men are my children, just as I desire for my children that they should obtain welfare and happiness both in this world and the next. So do I desire for all men as well." An ancient emperor expressing universal compassion. It sounds almost too good to be true, but the stone edicts survive, the words still readable, after 2,300 years. After the Mauryan Empire declined, India fragmented again until the Gupta Empire unified much of northern India from 320 to 550 CE. This period is called India's Golden Age. Art, literature, science, and mathematics flourished. Gupta mathematicians invented the decimal system as we know it, using the digits 0 through 9 with place value. Before this, mathematics was clumsy. Roman numerals, for instance, make multiplication nearly impossible. But with decimal notation and zero, complex calculations become manageable. This system, developed in India, was adopted by Arab mathematicians and eventually reached Europe, where they're still called Arabic numerals, though their origin is Indian. The concept of zero as a number, not just a placeholder, was revolutionary. Brahmagupta, a 7th century Indian mathematician, established rules for arithmetic with zero and negative numbers. What is 3 minus 5? Before negative numbers, the question was meaningless. You can't take 5 from 3. But Brahmagupta said the answer is negative 2, and he explained how to calculate with such numbers. This opened new mathematical possibilities. Aryabhata, a 5th century mathematician and astronomer, calculated pi as 3.1416, accurate to 4 decimal places. He explained solar and lunar eclipses correctly, understanding that the moon reflects the sun's light and Earth's shadow causes lunar eclipses. He proposed that Earth rotates on its axis, which is why the stars appear to move across the sky. This was 1,000 years before Copernicus made the same argument in Europe. Sanskrit literature reached extraordinary heights during the Gupta period. The Mahabharata and Ramayana, epics composed over centuries, were finalized. The Mahabharata is the longest epic poem ever written, over 100,000 verses. It's 4 times the length of the Bible. The central story is a war between cousins over a kingdom, but woven throughout are philosophical discussions, myths, and stories within stories. The Bhagavad Gita, one of Hinduism's most important texts, appears in the Mahabharata as a conversation between the warrior Arjuna and the god Krishna on the eve of battle, discussing duty, morality, and the nature of existence. The Ajanta caves in western India, or Buddhist monasteries, carved into a cliff face between the 2nd century BCE and 5th century CE. Monks lived in these caves, meditating and studying. The walls are covered in frescoes, painted over 1,500 years ago, depicting stories from Buddha's previous lives. The colors remain vibrant, reds and blues, and golds glowing in lamplight. The artists mixed pigments from minerals and plants, creating paints that have lasted while most ancient paintings have faded to nothing. Nalanda University was founded around 427 CE in what is now Bihar, India. It became the world's first residential university, attracting students from across Asia, and at its peak, Nalanda had 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers. The library was housed in three buildings, one of them 9 stories tall, containing 9 million manuscripts. Students studied Buddhism, but also logic, grammar, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. In 1193 CE, the Turkish military commander Bakhtiar Khilji invaded and destroyed Nalanda. He burned the library. The fires supposedly burned for 3 months, so many books fueling the flames. Thousands of monks were killed. Nalanda, which had operated for over 700 years, was annihilated. It's hard to imagine how much knowledge was lost in that fire, what scientific discoveries, what philosophical insights, what literary masterpieces turned to ash and were forgotten forever. While India was flourishing under the Guptas, Southeast Asia was developing its own remarkable civilizations. The Khmer Empire dominated the region from the 9th to 15th centuries, centered in what is now Cambodia. Around 1150 CE, King Surivarman II built Angkor Wat, originally a Hindu temple dedicated to Vishnu, later converted to Buddhism. Angkor Wat is the largest religious monument ever built. The temple complex covers 162 hectares, surrounded by a moat 200 meters wide. The central tower rises 65 meters above the ground. The walls are covered with intricate bas reliefs showing scenes from Hindu epics, battles, and celestial dancers called apsaras. Over 1,800 apsaras are carved into the walls, each with a unique face and pose. But Angkor Wat was just one temple in a vast city. Angkor was the world's largest pre-industrial city, spreading over 1,000 square kilometers. At its peak, it supported up to 1 million people. This was possible because of sophisticated water management. The Khmer built massive reservoirs called barays, some holding billions of gallons of water. A complex system of canals and channels distributed water throughout the city and surrounding farmland. The Khmer captured monsoon floodwaters and stored them for the dry season. This allowed multiple rice harvests per year, producing surplus food that supported a large non-farming population of priests, artists, soldiers, and administrators. But the system was fragile. Climate change in the 14th and 15th centuries brought alternating droughts and massive floods. The hydraulic system broke down. Crop failures led to political instability. Angkor was gradually abandoned, the jungle reclaiming temples and palaces. Across the sea, Japan was developing its own unique culture. The Japanese islands were populated by indigenous Jomon people for thousands of years. Around 300 BCE, the Yayoi people arrived from the Asian mainland, bringing rice agriculture and bronze tools. These two populations mixed, creating the ancestors of modern Japanese. Japan's native religion is Shinto, meaning the way of the kami. Kami are spirits inhabiting natural features like mountains, rivers, trees, and waterfalls. Mount Fuji is sacred. Ancient trees are sacred. Waterfalls are sacred. Shinto has no founder, no scripture, no dogma. It's a collection of rituals and practices venerating the natural world and ancestral spirits. Buddhism arrived in Japan in the 6th century CE, brought by Korean missionaries. Instead of replacing Shinto, Buddhism merged with it. Most Japanese practice both religions simultaneously. Shinto ceremonies for births and weddings, Buddhist ceremonies for funerals. Temples and shrines coexist, sometimes in the same compound. This religious flexibility, this ability to hold multiple truth systems simultaneously, became characteristic of Japanese culture. The tale of Genji, written around 1010 CE by Lady Murasaki Shikibu, is considered the world's first novel. It follows Prince Genji through his romantic and political adventures in the Heian period imperial court. The novel is psychologically sophisticated, exploring emotions and motivations in ways that feel modern. Lady Murasaki understood human nature profoundly, capturing the subtle social dynamics of court life, where every gesture, every poem, every choice of clothing carried meaning. The samurai class emerged during Japan's medieval period. Samurai were warriors who followed Bushido, the way of the warrior, a code emphasizing honor, loyalty, courage, and readiness to die. Samurai practiced Zen Buddhism, using meditation to prepare for death without fear. If you accept that death can come at any moment, you can act with complete commitment without hesitation. Samurai trained relentlessly with the sword, viewing swordplay as a spiritual discipline. The katana, the curved Japanese sword, was considered the soul of the samurai. Swordsmiths were honored artisans. Creating a katana involved folding steel thousands of times, creating layers that gave the blade flexibility and strength. A skilled samurai could cut through bamboo or even other swords in a single stroke. Korea, Japan's neighbor, had a profound influence on Japanese culture while developing its own sophisticated civilization. The Korean Three Kingdoms period saw Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla competing for dominance. Silla eventually unified Korea in 668 CE with support from Tang Dynasty China. But this wasn't Chinese conquest. Silla remained independent, Korean, merely allied with China. Korean artisans created celadon pottery with a distinctive jade green glaze that was prized across Asia. The exact technique for achieving the perfect celadon color was a closely guarded secret. Some techniques were eventually lost, making certain antique celadon pieces irreproducible today. The pottery was both functional and beautiful, embodying the Korean aesthetic principle that everyday objects should bring joy. Korea also innovated in printing technology. In 1234 CE, Korean craftsmen invented movable metal type for printing, creating individual metal characters that could be rearranged and reused. This was 200 years before Gutenberg's printing press. However, Korean writing uses thousands of Chinese characters, plus the Korean alphabet, making printing more complex than in Europe, where only 26 letters were needed. Still, the innovation demonstrates Korean technological sophistication. The Silk Road was the network of trade routes connecting east and west for over 1,500 years. It wasn't a single road, but many routes crossing Central Asia, through deserts, and over mountains. Silk moved west from China. Spices came from India. Glass and wool traveled east from Rome and Byzantium. But more than goods, the Silk Road carried ideas. Buddhism spread from India to China along the Silk Road, transforming as it traveled. Chinese Buddhism incorporated Taoist concepts. Later, it reached Korea and Japan, transforming further. Christianity spread east along the Silk Road. Nestorian Christians established communities in Central Asia and China. Islam spread along these routes. After the 7th century, the Silk Road was a conduit for culture, religion, technology, and disease. The Black Death, The plague that killed one-third of Europe's population in the 14th century likely traveled from China to Europe along the Silk Road. Fleas on rats carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Trading caravans carried infected rats from city to city, spreading death across continents. The Silk Road giveth and taketh away. Persia sat the crossroads between East and West. The Persian Empire, under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, was the first superpower, stretching from Egypt to India. Cyrus is remembered as remarkably tolerant for an ancient conqueror. When he captured Babylon, he freed the Jewish people enslaved there and let them return to Jerusalem. The Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document from 539 BCE, has been called the first declaration of human rights, though that's probably overstating it. Still, Cyrus proclaimed that people should be free to worship their own gods, a radical idea in an age when conquerors typically imposed their religion. The Persian Empire developed an efficient postal system with relay stations every 14 miles. Fresh horses waited at each station. A message could travel 1,600 miles in a week, faster than any other ancient communication system. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote about Persian messengers. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. This phrase, translated loosely, later became the unofficial motto of the United States Postal Service. Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, originated in ancient Persia. Zoroaster, the prophet, taught that there is one God, Ahura Mazda, the creator of all good things. Opposing him is Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. Humans must choose between good and evil. Life is a cosmic struggle between light and darkness. At the end of time, good will triumph and evil will be destroyed. These ideas influenced Judaism during the Babylonian exile, when Jews lived under Persian rule. Concepts of heaven and hell, angels and demons, a final judgment and resurrection of the dead, these ideas appear more prominently in Judaism after the Persian period. Through Judaism, they influenced Christianity and Islam. Zoroastrianism shaped the three Abrahamic religions in ways we're still discovering. The Sassanid Persian Empire, lasting from 224 to 651 CE, was Rome's great rival. For centuries, Rome and Persia fought over Mesopotamia and Armenia, neither able to decisively defeat the other. The Sassanids patronized art and learning. Their capital, Ctesiphon, had a palace with a vaulted hall spanning 25 meters without supporting pillars, one of the largest arch spans in the ancient world. But in 651 CE, Arab Muslim armies conquered the Sassanid Empire during the rapid expansion following Muhammad's death. Persia converted to Islam, though Persians maintained their distinct culture and eventually developed Shia Islam as separate from the Sunni Islam dominant among Arabs. Persian language, literature, and art influenced Islamic civilization profoundly. As the sun sets over the mountains of Central Asia, it illuminates the same trade routes where caravans once traveled. The Silk Road cities are mostly ruins now, buried under sand or reduced to archaeological sites. But for over a millennium, these routes connected half the world. A merchant in Rome could wear silk from China. A Buddhist monk in China could read texts translated from Sanskrit. A Persian diplomat could advise a Chinese emperor. The ancient world was more connected than we often imagine. Tonight, As you drift deeper toward sleep, imagine standing on the Great Wall of China at dawn, looking west toward Central Asia. Somewhere beyond the horizon, caravans are moving, camels loaded with silk and spices, merchants speaking a dozen languages, ideas traveling faster than goods. The ancient world was not isolated pockets of civilization. It was a vast web of connection, each culture influencing and being influenced by others. But everything changes. Empires rise and empires fall. Even the greatest civilizations are temporary. The ancient world was giving way to the medieval. Old gods were fading. New religions were spreading. The patterns that had governed human life for millennia were breaking down and reforming into something different. There's a feeling of ending in the air tonight. Not a sudden ending, not catastrophe or collapse, but the slow twilight when one age fades into another. The ancient world didn't end on a specific date. It transformed gradually, century by century, as old certainties dissolved and new patterns emerged. The migration period in Europe, roughly 300 to 700 CE, saw barbarian tribes moving across the continent. The Huns, nomadic warriors from Central Asia, pushed westward, displacing Germanic tribes, who in turn invaded Roman territory. Attila the Hun created an empire stretching from Central Asia to Germany in the 5th century. He extracted tribute from Rome, raided the Balkans and Gaul, and terrified Europe. Romans called the Huns the scourge of God, divine punishment for Roman sins. But Attila died in 453 CE, supposedly from a nosebleed on his wedding night, and his empire collapsed immediately. Without Attila's personality holding it together, the Hun Confederation dissolved. The Huns vanished from history as mysteriously as they'd appeared. Germanic tribes carved kingdoms from Roman territory, Visigoths in Spain, Vandals in North Africa, Franks in Gaul, Angles and Saxons in Britain. These weren't necessarily violent conquests. Often barbarian leaders were hired as Roman generals, given land to settle, and gradually became independent rulers as central Roman authority faded. The transformation was messy and complex, not a simple story of barbarians destroying civilization. The Germanic tribes preserved much of Roman culture while blending it with their own traditions. They converted to Christianity, mostly the Arian form initially, later Catholic Christianity. They used Latin for administration. They kept Roman law in modified forms. Medieval Europe emerged from this fusion of Roman, Germanic, and Christian elements. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, continued for another 1,000 years. Constantinople, surrounded by massive walls built by Emperor Theodosius II, was nearly impregnable. The Theodosian walls, completed in 413 CE, protected the city from invasion for 800 years. Multiple lines of walls and towers, moats and fortifications created a defensive system that stopped countless sieges. Inside those walls, Byzantines preserved Greek and Roman knowledge. Libraries in Constantinople held texts that would have been lost forever otherwise. When Constantinople finally fell to Ottoman Turks in 1453, Byzantine scholars fled west, bringing manuscripts to Italy. These texts sparked the Renaissance. Without Byzantine preservation, most of ancient Greek philosophy, science, and literature would have vanished. Islam emerged in the 7th century, spreading from Arabia across 3 continents within a century. Muhammad received revelations starting in 610 CE in Mecca. He preached monotheism, social justice, and submission to God's will. Islam means submission. Muslim means one who submits. After Muhammad's death in 632 CE, his followers spread Islam through conquest and conversion. By 732 CE, just 100 years after Muhammad's death, Islamic caliphates stretched from Spain to India. This remains one of the fastest expansions in history. The Umayyad Caliphate ruled territories larger than Rome at its peak, but unlike Rome, which took centuries to build its empire, Islam exploded across the map in decades. The Islamic Golden Age, roughly 800 to 1300 CE, saw extraordinary intellectual achievements. While Europe struggled through the early Middle Ages, Islamic civilization flourished. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, founded around 830 CE, became a center of learning. Scholars translated texts from Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and other languages into Arabic. They didn't just preserve ancient knowledge, they expanded it. Khwarizmi, a 9th century Persian mathematician working in Baghdad, wrote a book on algebra. The word algebra comes from algebra in the book's title. His name, Al-Khwarizmi, became the word algorithm. He explained the decimal system using Indian numerals, introducing these numerals to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe. His work laid foundations for modern mathematics. Islamic scholars pioneered advances in medicine, astronomy, optics, and chemistry. Al-Razi wrote comprehensive medical encyclopedias. Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine, which remained a standard medical text in Europe until the 17th century. Ibn al-Haytham, al-Hazan, conducted experiments on light and vision, essentially inventing the scientific method centuries before Francis Bacon. Islamic civilization preserved and expanded human knowledge during centuries when much of Europe had lost access to learning. When medieval European scholars wanted to study Aristotle, they often read him in Latin translations from Arabic translations from the original Greek, because the Greek originals had been lost in Western Europe. Vikings exploded out of Scandinavia starting in 793 CE with a raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in England. For the next 3 centuries, Viking longships appeared on coasts and rivers across Europe, raiding, trading, and settling. Vikings reached North America around 1000 CE, establishing a settlement at Lansac Meadows in Newfoundland, 500 years before Columbus. Viking longships were technological marvels. Shallow draft allowed them to navigate rivers as easily as seas. They could be rowed or sailed. Vikings raided up rivers deep into Europe, attacking Paris, sacking monasteries in Ireland, even reaching Constantinople. But Vikings weren't just raiders. They were traders who connected the Baltic with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. Archaeologists have found Arabic coins and Viking hordes in Scandinavia, evidence of trade networks spanning half the world. The ancient world was transforming rather than ending. Christianity spread across Europe, replacing or absorbing pagan practices. Churches were built on sacred groves. Saints replaced local spirits. Christmas absorbed winter solstice festivals. The old gods didn't disappear immediately. They faded gradually, becoming folklore, fairy tales, half-remembered myths. Medieval monks in monasteries copied Roman texts, preserving them for future generations. They didn't always understand what they were copying. Latin became a scholarly language, disconnected from spoken languages. But the act of copying preserved knowledge through the Dark Ages until Europe was ready to rediscover it during the Renaissance. Islamic scholars continued the scientific traditions of the ancient world, expanding them with new discoveries. Chinese inventions like paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass gradually spread westward, transforming societies. Indian mathematical concepts reached Europe through Arabic intermediaries. The world was becoming more connected, knowledge flowing across cultures. Ancient knowledge transformed rather than disappeared. Buddhist monks carried Indian philosophy to China, where it merged with Taoism and Confucianism to create something new. Christianity absorbed Greek philosophy through early church fathers who studied Plato and Aristotle. Islamic scholars built on Greek mathematics and astronomy while developing their own innovations. Every civilization believed it would last forever. Egyptians building pyramids thought they were creating eternity. Romans called their city eternal. Chinese dynasties claimed the mandate of heaven, but all transformed into something new, not extinction, but metamorphosis. The beautiful thing, the peaceful thing to remember as you drift towards sleep is that ordinary people continued through all these changes. Farmers planted crops, parents raised children, friends gathered to share meals, lovers held each other under stars that cared nothing for empires. The grand sweep of history is made of countless small moments of people living, loving, struggling, dreaming. Archaeological evidence shows ancient children played with toys that would be recognizable today: dolls, balls, miniature animals. Families ate dinner together. People fell in love. They told jokes and laughed with friends. The graffiti from Pompeii is startlingly familiar. Love declarations, political slogans, insults. One wall reads, "I wonder, O wall, that you have not yet collapsed under the weight of so much nonsense." People complaining about graffiti 2,000 years ago. We are not so different from them. They looked at the same moon, saw the same stars arranged in the same constellations. They wondered about existence and meaning. They feared death and hoped for something beyond. They created beauty because beauty matters even when life is hard, maybe especially when life is hard. The ruins left behind, crumbling temples and broken statues, silent cities reclaimed by jungle or desert. They remind us that nothing lasts forever. Every empire falls. Every civilization transforms. Every person dies. But this isn't depressing. It's liberating. The impermanence makes everything more precious. Those ancient people, with names mostly forgotten, faces unknown, they lived fully. They built magnificent things, knowing the buildings would outlast them. They wrote books and poems that survived millennia. They made scientific discoveries that laid foundations for everything that came after. They asked questions that we're still trying to answer, and now we carry forward their legacy. The letters you read are descended from Phoenician script. The numbers you use were developed in India. The philosophical questions that keep you awake at night were first asked by Greeks. The rice you eat was first domesticated in China. The mathematics that put rockets into space started with Babylonian stargazers. Every advantage we have, every tool and concept and technique, we inherited from the ancients. Tonight, you're part of that continuing story. You're a link in the chain connecting the past to the future. Your thoughts, your dreams, your life, They matter just as those ancient lives mattered, not because you'll be remembered forever. Most of us won't be, but because you're here now, experiencing this moment, this breath, this heartbeat, under the same stars that shone on Babylon and Tenochtitlan and Rome. The ancient civilizations fell asleep each night, just like you're falling asleep now. They dreamed, and their dreams shaped our world. The farmer, dreaming of irrigation, created agriculture. The astronomer, dreaming of patterns and stars, created mathematics. The philosopher, dreaming of justice, created ethics. The artist, dreaming of beauty, created art that still moves us. Your dreams will shape worlds too, in ways you can't predict. The future is unwritten. The story continues. You're part of something larger than yourself, older than nations, deeper than any single culture. You're part of the human story, the long tale of clever apes who looked at stars and wondered, who made fire and art and cities, who loved and fought and built and destroyed, and somehow kept going, kept hoping, kept dreaming. So let yourself drift now. Let the weight of history settle gently over you like a blanket woven from millennia. You are safe. You are part of the great chain. Those who came before lived their lives so you could live yours. Those who come after will build on what you leave behind. The stars above you tonight are the same stars that shone on the pyramids and the Parthenon, on the Great Wall in Machu Picchu, on every ancient person who ever wondered what those lights in the sky meant. The stars don't care about empires. They shine on, indifferent and eternal, while we live our brief, bright lives below. Sleep now. Rest. Tomorrow you wake to continue the story, but tonight you can rest in the knowledge that everything that needed to happen to bring you to this moment has happened. Every choice, every chance, every rise and fall of every civilization led to now, to you, to this breath. The ancient world sleeps beneath your feet, layer upon layer, civilization upon civilization, dust returning to dust. But the dreams continue. The human spirit continues. The story continues. And so you sleep, cradled by history, warmed by the knowledge that you belong to something beautiful and terrible and magnificent, the long story of humanity still being written, still unfolding, still dreaming new worlds into existence. Good night.